Okay, this is part 4 of chapter 1 in King George. What was his problem? How to start a revolution. Step 4 is try again. Back in London, the British government was forced to face a painful fact. There was no money in this Stamp Act deal. Parliament voted to repeal, that means get rid of, the tax. King George reluctantly approved this decision. Colonists celebrated the news with feasts and dances. Boston's richest merchant, a guy named John Hancock, gave out free wine and put on a fireworks show outside his house. The happy people of New York City built a statue of King George and put it in a city park. Remember that statue? It will be back in the story later. What the colonists didn't realize was that the British leaders were already talking about new taxes. After all, the British government still needed money. And most leaders still insisted that the Britain had every right to tax the Americans. King George was especially firm on this point. He was a very stubborn fellow. So Parliament passed the Townshend Acts in 1767, when colonial merchants imported stuff like paint, paper, glass, and tea. They would now have to pay a tax based on the value of each item. Or would they? Step 5. Refuse to pay. Rather than pay the new taxes, colonists started boycotting, that means refusing to buy, British imports. Women were the driving force behind these boycotts. Hannah Griffiths of Pennsylvania expressed the determination of many colonial women in a poem. There's Hannah right there. Stand firmly resolved and bid Grenville to see that rather than freedom we'll part with our tea. And well as we love the dear draught when we're dry, as American patriots, our taste we deny. It's a nice poem. John Hancock found another way to get around paying taxes. Hancock simply snuck his goods past the tax collectors. He knew that smuggling was illegal, but he didn't feel too guilty about it. To Hancock, smuggling seemed like a fair response to an unfair law. Of course, the British wanted to stop smugglers like Hancock, but you have to remember, colonists really hated these taxes. So any British official who tried too hard to collect taxes was taking a serious risk. Think of poor John Malcolm, for example. This British official was stripped to the waist, smeared with hot tar, and covered with feathers from a pillow. Then he was pulled through Boston in a cart, just to make the humiliation complete. What was the worst thing about getting tarred and feathered? Malcolm said the most painful part was trying to rip the tar off his burned body. He mailed a box of his tar and feathers, with bits of his skin still attached, to the British government in London. They sympathized. They sent him money. Then, in the spring of 1768, Hancock's ship Liberty, full of smuggled wine from France, was seized by tax agents in Boston. Furious members of the Sons of Liberty gathered at the docks where Sam Adams was heard shouting, here's Sam Adams right here, "If you are men, then behave like men. Let us take up arms immediately and be free." The Sons spent the night throwing stones at the tax collectors' houses. They even dragged a tax agent's boat out of the water, lit it on fire, in front of John Hancock's house. The terrified taxmen escaped to an island in Boston Harbor. Step 6. Send in the warships. King George did not appreciate this form of protest. The world's most powerful country can't have its government employees hiding on an island. It doesn't look good. It was time to get tough with the colonists. In the words of Frederick North, one of the king's favorite advisors, America must fear you before she can love you. Why not just repeal the Townshend Acts? I hope we shall never think of it, snapped North. Till we see America prostrate, that means face down, at our feet. North was another guy who didn't understand Americans. On October 1768, British warships sailed into Boston Harbor. Under the command of General Thomas Gage, 1,000 British soldiers marched off the ships and paraded through town in their bright red coats, beating drums and dragging cannons. Well, that should solve everything, right? Well, nothing too serious happened until March 1770. On March 2nd, a British soldier named Patrick Walker was looking for a little extra work. In Boston, the soldiers were paid almost nothing. He stopped by a rope walk, an outdoor workshop where ropes were made, and spoke with a rope maker named William Green. Green said, "Soldier, do you want work?" Walker said, "Yes." Green said, "Well then, go clean my outhouse." Only Green didn't say outhouse. He used a word that I can't print here. Walker was quite offended. He got up a group of soldiers, and they attacked the rope makers with wooden clubs. The rope makers fought back with clubs of their own. It was an ugly scene. The point of all this story is simple. The British soldiers and the people of Boston weren't getting along. And it's easy to see why. The soldiers were in town to enforce laws that made people furious. And people took their anger out on the soldiers. Did the soldiers deserve such hatred? Maybe not. Most were 17 and 18-year-old boys from poor families. This was the only job they could get, and they hated being in Boston just as much as the people hated having them. On the night of March 5th, 1770, 3 days after the rope walk, all the anger in Boston exploded into violence. Step 7. Fire into a crowd. It was a cold night. There was a foot of snow on the ground. Sons of Liberty walked the streets in groups, wooden clubs in hand. They watched the soldiers, and the soldiers watched them. Both sides were expecting something to happen, but no one thought it would begin with an apprentice wig maker named Edward Garrick. At about 8:30, young Garrick passed a British officer in the street. Garrick pointed to the officer and shouted, "There goes the fellow that won't pay my master for dressing his hair." That's a serious insult. Accusing a gentleman of not paying his debts? A young British soldier named Hugh White stepped forward to defend his officer. Garrick and White exchanged a few curses. Then White cracked Garrick in the head with the butt of his musket. Garrick went down, scrambled up, and yelped for help. A crowd gathered quickly. At first, it was just a few of Garrick's friends. Then people started coming from all over town. A man named Crispus Attucks led a group of fellow sailors from the wharf to the scene of the action. Attucks was 6 feet 2 inches tall, about 45 years old. He had escaped from slavery 20 years before. Witnesses said he had a stick or a club in his hand. Hugh White called out to his fellow soldiers for backup. 8 soldiers pushed their way through to the mob around White. Around 300 people surrounded the soldiers, cursing at them and pelting them with snowballs, chunks of ice, even oyster shells. The soldiers pointed their loaded guns. The crowd shoved closer and closer to the blades of the British bayonets, shouting, "You dare not fire! You can't kill us all!" Then there was a shot. Then a lot of shots. Then smoke and shocked silence. The crowd backed away. Crispus Attucks lay in the snow, killed instantly by 2 bullets through the chest. 6 other men had been shot also. 4 of them died. At a town meeting the next morning, Samuel Adams charged British soldiers with firing into a crowd of harmless protesters. As we have seen, this was not exactly true. Samuel was a gifted storyteller. He called the soldiers bloody murderers. He gave the incident a name that everyone would remember: the Boston Massacre.